540 soldiers were dying in a valley that command had written off as unrecoverable. Captain Natasha "Tasha" Brennan, a transport pilot they'd called too cautious and not aggressive enough for combat missions, made a decision that would either save them all or end her career forever. She fired up her aircraft, ignored direct orders from her commanding officer, and flew straight into what military analysts later called the most hostile airspace of the entire war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But that moment of defiance didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of 8 years of being systematically overlooked, underestimated, and pushed aside by an aviation culture that still couldn't imagine women belonged in the cockpit during real combat. Captain Natasha Brennan had been flying for the 4th Air Mobility Wing at Kandahar Airbase for 8 years, and in those 8 years, she'd perfected the art of being invisible. Not the kind of invisibility that came from incompetence, but the deliberate invisibility that came from being a woman in a field that still treated female pilots as experimental additions rather than essential operators. At 34, Tasha possessed a flight record that should have made her a legend. 0 accidents across 1,847 flight hours in hostile territory. She could land a C-130 Hercules on runways that other pilots wouldn't even attempt, threading through mountain passes in 0 visibility conditions that would ground entire squadrons. She delivered critical supplies to forward operating bases under mortar fire, evacuated wounded soldiers from landing zones that were still hot with enemy contact, and once kept a damaged aircraft in the air for 3 hours longer than engineering specifications said was possible. Her call sign should have reflected her skill. Instead, the other pilots called her steady, and not as a compliment. To them, it meant she was predictable, unadventurous, the safe choice for milk runs and routine cargo hauls. The kind of pilot you called when you needed supplies delivered, not when you needed someone who could handle real combat aviation. What none of them knew was that Tasha spent every spare moment studying advanced combat flight tactics that went far beyond her official training. While other pilots were in the rec room watching movies or playing cards, she was in the flight simulator running attack patterns and evasive maneuvers. She'd memorized the performance specifications of every aircraft in their fleet, not just the transports she was assigned to fly. She knew the weapons systems, the tactical insertion protocols, the close air support procedures that combat pilots trained on. She'd even earned her fixed-wing combat certification through a special program 3 years ago, completing it during her leave time without telling anyone at Kandahar. The qualification sat in her personnel file, but her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Hastings, had never bothered to look that deep. To him, Tasha was a transport pilot, and transport pilots stayed in their lane. This particular morning began like hundreds before it. Tasha arrived at the Flight Operations Center at 0430 hours, 2 hours before her scheduled brief, and settled into her routine pre-flight checks. The Operations Center hummed with the usual controlled chaos of a military airbase at war: radio chatter, weather updates, mission briefs being updated in real time. She was reviewing meteorological data for her scheduled supply run when Lieutenant Colonel Hastings entered, followed by his usual entourage, Major Kyle Vance, the squadron's executive officer who treated female pilots like secretaries with wings, and Captain Troy Wolcott, the Golden Boy fighter jock who'd been transferred to their unit after washing out of an elite fighter squadron but still acted like he was flying F-16s. "Brennan," Hastings called out, not bothering to approach her station. "Weather's looking rough in Sector 7. Think you can handle the supply run to Firebase Phoenix, or should I assign it to someone with more experience in adverse conditions?" Tasha looked up from her weather displays, keeping her expression neutral despite the familiar sting. She'd flown in worse conditions more times than Hastings had logged flight hours in the past year, but pointing that out would only confirm his belief that she was difficult. "The route's clear, sir. I've already identified an alternate approach vector that avoids the worst of the turbulence. Supply run will be completed on schedule." Vance smirked visibly. "Always by the book, aren't you, Brennan? Must be nice never taking any risks." "Actually," Tasha replied calmly, "calculated risk assessment is part of professional aviation. But I've also prepared contingency plans for the 3 most likely emergency scenarios we might encounter. If you'd like, I can brief you on the tactical considerations for—" "We don't need a classroom lecture, Captain," Hastings interrupted sharply. "Just deliver the supplies and try not to burn too much fuel doing it. Some of us have actual combat missions to plan." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Hastings and his followers left the operations center, Tasha remained at her station, staring at her displays. Tucked in the corner of her screen was an email she'd received 3 weeks ago, a message from Colonel Patricia Sanderson at Air Combat Command Headquarters. The subject line read, "Regarding your application for combat aviation advisory position." Tasha had been quietly building a case for reassignment to a position where her skills would be properly utilized. She documented every successful mission, every difficult landing, every emergency situation she'd navigated flawlessly. She'd gathered recommendations from ground commanders who'd watched her deliver supplies under impossible conditions, from crew chiefs who marveled at her aircraft handling, from medical personnel whose lives she'd saved during emergency evacuations. What Hastings didn't know was that Colonel Sanderson had been a pioneer for women in military aviation 2 decades earlier. She understood exactly what Tasha was facing, and she was building a program specifically designed to identify and promote talented female aviators who were being systematically overlooked by old guard commanders like Hastings. Email response had arrived yesterday. Application approved. Report to Andrews Air Force Base in 6 weeks for final evaluation and assignment. 6 weeks. Tasha just had to keep her head down for 6 more weeks, complete her routine missions, and avoid giving Hastings any excuse to block her transfer. Then she'd be gone from Kandahar, from the casual dismissals and the constant need to prove herself to people who'd already decided she didn't belong. She saved her flight plans and stood up, grabbing her flight suit and helmet. As she walked toward the hangar where her C-130 waited, she passed the tactical operations board where current missions were displayed. Her eyes caught on a new entry that hadn't been there during her earlier check. Operation Iron Sentinel Battalion-sized force, 540 personnel, deployed to Tamar Valley for insurgent interdiction. Expected duration, 72 hours. Tasha paused, studying the deployment details. Tamar Valley was a known hotspot, a narrow canyon system surrounded by high ridges that provided perfect positions for ambush. The terrain made air support difficult and evacuation nearly impossible if things went wrong. She noticed something else too. The operation was being led by Colonel James Rutherford, a ground commander known for aggressive tactics and a tendency to push his units deep into hostile territory. She'd flown support missions for Rutherford before and had watched him dismiss intelligence warnings that later proved accurate. A small knot of concern formed in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't her mission. She was just a transport pilot with a supply run to complete. Whatever happened in Tamar Valley was someone else's problem. As Tasha climbed into her aircraft and began her pre-flight procedures, she had no idea that in less than 48 hours, those 540 soldiers in Tamar Valley would become her problem in the most desperate way imaginable. She had no idea that Lieutenant Colonel Hastings would make a decision that would leave those soldiers to die. And she had no idea that her choice to ignore his direct orders would become the defining moment, not just of her career, but of modern military aviation history, not for now. She was just Steady Brennan, the reliable transport pilot nobody noticed. The woman who played by the rules and stayed in her lane. But sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones everyone underestimates. And sometimes, following orders is the worst thing a soldier can do. The supply run to Firebase Phoenix went exactly as Tasha had planned. She threaded through the mountain passes with the precision that had earned her reputation for reliability, delivered the supplies 40 minutes ahead of schedule, and returned to Kandahar without incident. It was the kind of flawless execution that should have earned recognition, but instead simply met expectations. When she landed, the operations center was in controlled chaos. Something had changed in the 3 hours she'd been airborne. Master Sergeant Jamal Foster, the senior flight operations coordinator who'd worked with Tasha since her first day at Kandahar, met her as she completed her post-flight inspection. His normally calm demeanor was replaced with visible tension. "Brennan, you need to hear this," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Operation Iron Sentinel is falling apart." Tasha felt that knot of concern return. What happened? Rutherford pushed his battalion deeper into Talmer Valley than planned. They were supposed to be conducting reconnaissance and limited engagement, but he went for a full assault on what intelligence identified as a major insurgent stronghold. Foster pulled up a tactical map on his tablet. Except it wasn't just a stronghold. It was bait. The map showed the Talmer Valley in stark detail. The battalion's position was marked in red, surrounded by enemy contact markers on all sides. The valley entrance, their only viable escape route, was now controlled by hostile forces that had moved in behind them. "They're trapped," Tasha said quietly. "Gets worse. The ambush knocked out most of their heavy equipment, including their communications array. They've got limited satellite comms, but ground-to-air coordination is nearly impossible. And the terrain makes helicopter extraction suicidal. Those ridge lines give enemy forces perfect firing positions on anything that flies into that valley. What about air support? Fast movers could suppress those positions." Foster shook his head. "Weather's moving in. Heavy cloud cover, high winds. Jets can't do precision strikes in those conditions without risking friendly fire. Command is looking at options, but—" He trailed off, his expression making clear what he didn't want to say. "They're considering leaving them," Tasha finished. "Not officially. But I've heard the phrases acceptable losses and tactical withdrawal mentioned in the briefing room." Tasha stared at the map, her mind already running calculations. The valley was 47 miles from Kandahar. A C-130 could make that flight in under 20 minutes. The valley floor was rough but potentially landable for a skilled pilot. The real problem was the approach. Flying into a canyon surrounded by enemy positions was precisely the kind of aggressive, risk-taking aviation that everyone said she wasn't capable of. "When's the command briefing?" she asked. 30 minutes. "But Tasha—" Foster hesitated. "Hastings has already made his position clear. He's not risking aircraft and pilots for what he's calling a ground commander's mistake." The briefing room was packed when Tasha arrived. She took a position near the back, watching as Lieutenant Colonel Hastings stood before the assembled officers. His expression grave, but his body language suggesting he'd already made his decision. "Gentlemen and ladies," he added with a glance that briefly landed on Tasha and the 2 other female pilots present. "We're facing a difficult situation. Colonel Rutherford's battalion is pinned down in Talmer Valley under heavy fire. Current weather conditions and enemy positions make standard extraction impossible." Major Vance brought up imagery on the main display screen. The valley looked even worse from satellite perspective, a narrow corridor of death with enemy forces commanding every high position. "Central Command is exploring diplomatic options," Hastings continued. There's a possibility of negotiated withdrawal, potentially through third-party mediation. In the meantime, our priority is preserving our aviation assets for operations where we can make a meaningful difference. Captain Wolcott, the former fighter pilot, raised his hand. Sir, what about a combat insertion? Load up gunships, suppress the enemy positions, and extract in phases? The weather window closes in 6 hours, Hastings replied. After that, we're looking at 3 days of storms. Any aircraft in that valley would be trapped. I'm not sacrificing more personnel on a low-probability rescue attempt. Tasha found herself standing without consciously deciding to do so. Sir, a C-130 could land in that valley. The room went silent. Every head turned toward her. Hastings's expression hardened. Excuse me, Captain. The valley floor is approximately 800 meters of relatively flat terrain. Tasha continued, her voice steady despite feeling everyone's eyes on her. A C-130 can land in less than 600 meters under emergency conditions. We could land, load personnel, and extract before getting shot out of the sky by every insurgent on those ridgelines. Vance interrupted. Brennan, this isn't a supply run. This is a hot combat zone. I'm aware of that. Major, but if we use the terrain properly, coordinate the approach with the battalion's remaining defensive capabilities, and time the landing during the enemy's supply rotation, Captain Brennan. Hastings's voice cut through the room like a blade. You are a transport pilot. You fly supplies to secure bases. You are not qualified to make tactical assessments about combat aviation operations. Sir, I have fixed-wing combat certification. If you check my file, I don't need to check your file. Hastings stepped away from the briefing screen, moving toward where Tasha stood. I know exactly what you are. You're a pilot who follows checklists and procedures. You fly the same routes over and over because that's what you're capable of. And now, in this room, in front of experienced combat aviators, you're suggesting a suicide mission because you want to play hero. Tasha felt heat rising in her face, but she maintained her composure. Sir, I'm suggesting a viable extraction plan based on nothing but ego, Hastings interrupted. You think because you've logged some hours flying cargo that you understand combat operations? Those are 540 soldiers down there, Captain. This isn't about giving you an opportunity to prove you belong in a cockpit. This is about making realistic assessments of what's possible. With respect, sir, leaving 540 soldiers to die isn't realistic assessment. It's abandonment. The room erupted in murmurs. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. Foster, still near the back, gave Tasha a warning look that said she was crossing a line. Hastings's face flushed red. Captain Brennan, you are out of line. Those soldiers knew the risks when they deployed. Colonel Rutherford made decisions that put his battalion in an untenable position. It is not our responsibility to compound his mistake by losing aircraft and pilots in a doomed rescue attempt. So we just leave them? Tasha heard her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. We have the capability. We have the aircraft. We have pilots capable of. We have transport pilots, Hastings said coldly, including one who apparently can't distinguish between confidence and competence. Captain Wolcott here is a trained fighter pilot with actual combat experience, and he's telling you this mission is impossible. But somehow you think you know better? Wolcott leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a slight smirk on his face. No offense, Brennan, but steady doesn't exactly translate to combat aviator. This isn't about gender. It's about skill set. You're great at what you do, but what you do isn't this. Tasha looked around the room at the faces watching her. Some looked sympathetic. Others appeared annoyed at the disruption. A few seemed to be enjoying her public humiliation. These were pilots she'd flown alongside for 8 years, but in this moment, she was completely alone. Sir, she said quietly, trying one more time. If you just look at the tactical analysis I prepared. You prepared a tactical analysis? Hastings's tone dripped with condescension. Of course you did. Tell me, Captain, when exactly did you prepare this analysis? Before or after you were told this wasn't your concern? The implication was clear. She'd overstepped, operating outside her authority, meddling in matters that didn't concern transport pilots. I prepared it during my post-flight review, Tasha said. When I saw the situation developing in Telmer Valley, I thought, that's the problem, Captain. You thought you could solve a problem that actual combat aviators can't solve. You thought your opinion mattered in a tactical situation you're not qualified to assess. You thought wrong. Hastings returned to the front of the room. This briefing is concluded. All aircraft remain grounded pending weather assessment. Captain Brennan, you're to report to my office immediately following this meeting. Dismissed. As the room emptied, officers filed past Tasha without making eye contact. Only Foster paused beside her, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in silent support before he too departed. Tasha stood alone in the briefing room, staring at the tactical display still showing Telmer Valley. The red marker indicating the battalion's position seemed to pulse accusingly. 540 soldiers. Fathers, brothers, sons. Daughters too, probably. All of them left to die because the people with the power to save them had decided the risk wasn't worth it, or more accurately, because they'd decided that she wasn't capable of doing what needed to be done. In Lieutenant Colonel Hastings's office. The conversation was brief and brutal. You embarrassed yourself in there, Brennan, he said without preamble. More importantly, you embarrassed this squadron. Questioning command decisions, pushing tactical assessments you're not qualified to make. Undermining authority in front of junior officers. Sir, I was only trying to. I know what you were trying to do. You were trying to prove you're more than what you are. That you're some kind of combat pilot instead of the adequate transport aviator we actually need you to be. Hastings leaned forward across his desk. I'm going to be direct with you, Captain. You have a reputation for being reliable, and that's valuable. But this little display today showed me something concerning. You're developing delusions about your capabilities. Tasha gripped the arms of her chair, forcing herself to stay silent. I'm grounding you for the next 72 hours, pending a full evaluation of your judgment. You'll undergo psychological assessment to ensure you're fit for duty. And if I see any further indication that you can't stay in your lane, I'll have you transferred to a stateside logistics position so fast you won't have time to pack. Sir, those soldiers are not your concern. Hastings slammed his hand on the desk. Do you understand me, Captain? Not your concern. Your concern is following orders, maintaining your aircraft, and accepting your limitations. Can you do that? Or do we need to have a different conversation about your future in this military? Tasha met his eyes, seeing in them the absolute certainty that she was nothing more than he'd always believed. A competent but unexceptional pilot who should be grateful for the routine missions she was given. I understand. Sir, she said quietly. Good, you're dismissed. And Brennan? That transfer application you submitted? I'm recommending it be denied. You clearly need more time learning to operate within proper command structure before we can consider you for advanced positions. As Tasha left his office, she felt something shift inside her. For 8 years she'd played by the rules. She'd accepted the dismissals, the limitations, the constant need to prove herself to people who decided her worth before she ever entered a cockpit. She believed that patience and professionalism would eventually be rewarded. That competence would speak for itself. That the system, despite its flaws, would recognize excellence when it saw it. She'd been wrong. In her quarters that evening, Tasha sat at her desk, staring at 2 things. The first was her personnel file, showing all the certifications she'd earned, the missions she'd flown. The commendation she'd received from ground commanders who'd watched her deliver miracles under impossible conditions. The second was the tactical map of Tulmar Valley, with her detailed extraction plan outlined in precise technical language that any combat aviator would recognize as professionally competent. Her phone buzzed with a text from Foster. Weather window now 4 hours. Command still looking for diplomatic solution. Battalion reporting increasing casualties. Tasha looked at her flight suit hanging on the back of her door. She thought about the C-130 sitting in the hangar less than 400 meters away, fueled and ready for operations. She thought about 540 soldiers dying in a valley because the people with the power to save them had decided it was impossible. She thought about 8 years of being told what she couldn't do by people who'd never bothered to see what she actually could do. And for the first time in her military career, Captain Natasha Brennan began seriously considering what it would mean to disobey a direct order. The next morning arrived with deceptive calm. Tasha had barely slept, spending most of the night running flight simulations in her mind, calculating approach vectors, fuel consumption rates, and emergency contingencies. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that tactical map with the red marker representing 540 human beings waiting to die. At 0500 hours. She was in the mess hall nursing black coffee when Foster slid into the seat across from her. He didn't say anything at first, just set his tablet on the table between them. The screen showed an update from Tulmar Valley. Casualties now at 89 dead, 147 wounded, he said quietly. They're running out of ammunition and medical supplies. Command is still pursuing diplomatic channels, which apparently means they're trying to negotiate with people who have every incentive to let those soldiers bleed out. Tasha stared at the numbers. 89 dead. Each one a person who'd woken up 2 days ago, expecting to come home eventually. Each one with people who loved them, who were about to receive notifications that would destroy their worlds. Weather window? She asked. 3 hours, maybe less. After that, storms move in for at least 60 hours. Anyone still alive in that valley won't be by the time the weather clears. Foster leaned forward. Tasha, I know what you're thinking. I can see it in your eyes. Don't do it. Don't do what? Whatever you're planning. I've known you for 8 years. I've never seen you look like this. He paused. Hastings has sentries posted at the flight line. After your performance yesterday, he's worried you might try something stupid. Stupid like trying to save 540 soldiers. Stupid like throwing away your career, facing court-martial, and probably getting yourself killed in the process. Foster's voice was urgent, but not unkind. Tasha, I get it. I really do. But one pilot can't change what's happening here. The system has made its decision. The system is wrong. Maybe it is. But you can't fight the entire military command structure. You'll lose, and those soldiers will still die, and you'll have accomplished nothing except destroying yourself. Tasha looked at her old friend, seeing genuine concern in his face. Foster was one of the few people at Kandahar who'd always treated her as an equal, who'd recognized her skill without qualification or caveat. If anyone would understand, it should be him. What would you do? She asked. If you were me right now, knowing what we know. Foster was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I don't know. I'd want to be the hero. I'd want to believe I could make a difference. But I'd also know that the odds of success are close to zero, and the certainty of consequences is absolute. So you do nothing. I'd do what I could within the system. I'd make noise, file reports, go up the chain of command. We don't have time for the chain of command. Tasha interrupted. In 3 hours, that weather window closes. After that, it doesn't matter what reports get filed or what noise gets made. Those soldiers are dead. She stood up, leaving her coffee unfinished. Foster grabbed her wrist. Tasha, please. Think about what you're risking. Your career, your freedom, maybe your life. And for what? A mission that Hastings and every other experienced combat aviator says is impossible? Tasha gently pulled her hand free. Maybe they're right. Maybe it is impossible. But I'd rather try and fail than live the rest of my life knowing I could have tried and chose not to. As she walked away, Foster called after her. If you do this, I can't protect you. Nobody can. I know. Back in her quarters, Tasha changed into her flight suit with methodical precision. Each zipper, each pocket, each piece of equipment placed exactly where it needed to be. She'd done this thousands of times, but today every movement felt weighted with significance. She sat down at her desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. For several minutes, she stared at the blank page, then began writing to Colonel Patricia Sanderson. Air Combat Command. By the time you read this, I will have either succeeded in an unauthorized rescue operation or I will be dead. Either way, my career in the United States Air Force will be over. I want you to know that my decision to disobey orders was not made lightly or rashly. For 8 years, I have followed every rule, met every standard, and exceeded every expectation. I believe that professionalism and competence would eventually overcome the prejudices that have limited my opportunities. But this morning, 540 soldiers are dying in Talmer Valley, while commanders who have never questioned their own capabilities tell me that rescue is impossible. Not because they've tried and failed, but because they've decided not to try at all. I have the training. I have the skills. I have the aircraft. What I don't have is permission. And I've realized that sometimes, permission is exactly what stands between courage and action. If I survive, I will accept whatever consequences come. If I don't, I hope this letter helps explain why I made the choice I made. Some things are worth more than a career. Some things are worth more than following orders. 540 human lives are worth the risk I'm about to take. Respectfully, Captain Natasha Brennan. She sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it, and left it on her desk where it would be found. Then she grabbed her helmet and walked out of her quarters for what might be the last time. The flight line was exactly as Foster had warned. 2 security personnel were stationed near the hangars, their presence unusual for routine morning operations. Hastings wasn't taking chances. Tasha walked toward the operations building, her stride purposeful but not hurried. She nodded to the guards as she passed, just another pilot going about her duties. Inside the building, she found Lieutenant Amy Reeves, a younger pilot who'd arrived at Kandahar 6 months ago. "Reeves, I need a favor," Tasha said quietly. The lieutenant looked up from her pre-flight paperwork, surprised. "Sure, ma'am. What do you need?" "I need you to create a distraction at the north end of the flight line in about 10 minutes. Nothing dangerous, just something that gets the security team's attention for 3 or 4 minutes. Reeves frowned. "What kind of distraction?" "Use your judgment. Maybe you're concerned about something on one of the aircraft. Maybe you think you saw unauthorized personnel near the perimeter. I don't care what it is, as long as it works. Captain Brennan. If this is about Talmer Valley, it's about you trusting me for 10 minutes and not asking questions you don't want to know the answers to." Tasha met the younger pilot's eyes. "Will you do it?" Reeves studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. 10 minutes. North end of the flight line. Thank you. Tasha made her way to the equipment room, where flight crews stored their gear. She grabbed an emergency supply kit, extra communications equipment, and several items that weren't standard for transport missions. Nobody questioned her. Pilots often personalize their loadouts based on experience and preference. At precisely 0547 hours, she heard raised voices from the north end of the flight line. Through the window, she could see both security personnel moving quickly toward where Lieutenant Reeves was gesturing animatedly at something on the perimeter fence. Tasha didn't hesitate. She walked directly to Hangar 7, where her C-130 sat ready for operations. The crew chief, Technical Sergeant Raymond Mills, was running routine maintenance checks. "Mills, I need emergency preflight," Tasha said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "Ma'am? I wasn't notified of any scheduled. Command authorization came through 5 minutes ago. Priority medical supply run to Forward Base Delta. Weather window is closing. And we need to be wheels up in 15 minutes." It was a complete lie. But Tasha delivered it with the confidence of 8 years of legitimate operations. Mills knew her as the most by-the-book pilot on the base. Why would he question her now? "Yes, ma'am. Aircraft is fueled and ready. I'll need to get the loadmaster. No time. This is a solo run. Light load, quick turnaround." Tasha was already climbing into the cockpit, her hands moving through startup procedures with practiced efficiency. Mills looked uncertain but began pulling chocks and disconnecting ground equipment. Through the cockpit window, Tasha could see the security personnel still distracted at the far end of the flight line. She had maybe 2 more minutes before someone realized what was happening. The engines roared to life with their familiar turbine whine. Tasha ran through her checklist faster than she ever had, cutting corners that would have horrified her under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. "Kandahar Tower. This is Cargo 7 requesting immediate departure clearance," she said into her radio, keeping her voice steady and routine. There was a pause. "Cargo 7, we show no scheduled departures for your aircraft. Please verify authorization." This was it. The moment where her career ended, regardless of what happened next. "Tower, this is Cargo 7 declaring emergency priority under Operational Directive 97 Alpha. Request immediate clearance." Directive 97 Alpha was a rarely used protocol that gave aircraft commanders authority to launch without standard clearance in time-critical situations. Tasha was betting that the tower controller wouldn't have time to verify whether she actually had authorization to invoke it. Another pause, longer this time. "Cargo 7. Stand by." Through her side window, Tasha saw someone running toward the hangar. The security team had noticed. She had seconds, not minutes. "Tower, I have critical medical supplies for casualties with life-threatening injuries. Every minute of delay costs lives. I am beginning taxi with or without clearance." She released the brakes and started moving. The C-130 lumbered forward, picking up speed as she guided it toward the taxiway. In her mirror, she could see Mills looking confused, and beyond him, security personnel were definitely moving in her direction now. "Cargo 7, you are ordered to stop immediately. Unauthorized departure, return to hangar." The voice on the radio was different now, sharper, more authoritative. Probably a senior officer who'd been pulled into the situation. "Negative, Tower. Lives are at stake. Cargo 7 is departing." She reached the runway threshold, not bothering with the full taxi to the designated departure point. The aircraft was light, carrying minimal fuel and no cargo. She could make a short field takeoff if needed. "Cargo 7, this is Lieutenant Colonel Hastings. You are ordered to shut down engines immediately. Brennan, if you take off, you will be court-martialed. Your career is over. Stop this now." Tasha's hand hovered over the throttle controls for just a moment. Everything Foster had said was true. Everything Hastings was threatening was real. She was throwing away 8 years of service, facing criminal charges, risking not just her career but her freedom. But in Talmer Valley, 540 soldiers were dying while people with power chose to do nothing. She pushed the throttles forward. The Co-130's engines roared in response, and the aircraft began accelerating down the runway. "Brennan, stop. That's a direct order." The runway lights blurred past. The airspeed indicator climbed. 60 knots. 80 knots. 100 knots. Behind her at Kandahar Airbase, alarms were probably blaring. Hastings was probably screaming orders. Security forces were probably scrambling. Every moment of what she was doing was being recorded, documented, witnessed. 120 knots. The nose lifted. The runway fell away beneath her. Cargo 7 is airborne, Tasha said calmly into the radio. Disregard all previous communications. I am proceeding to Talmer Valley for emergency extraction of ground forces. Brennan out. She switched off the primary radio channel and turned toward the mountains where 540 soldiers were waiting to learn if anyone was coming to save them. Captain Natasha Brennan had just committed the most serious violation of military discipline possible. She had stolen a military aircraft, disobeyed direct orders from her commanding officer, and launched an unauthorized mission into hostile territory. Everything she'd worked for was gone. There was no coming back from this, regardless of what happened next. But for the first time in 8 years, she felt like she was finally doing exactly what she was meant to do. The mountains ahead looked dark and threatening. The weather was deteriorating by the minute. The mission was almost certainly impossible. Tasha set her course and pushed the throttles to maximum speed. She had maybe 2.5 hours before the weather window closed completely. Time to find out if steady, reliable. By the book, Captain Brennan could become the combat aviator everyone said she could never be. The C-130 cut through the morning air at maximum cruise speed. Every instrument in the cockpit displaying readings that Tasha had memorized from thousands of hours in this exact aircraft. But this flight was different from every single one of those previous missions. This time, she was alone in a 4-person cockpit, flying toward a combat zone without authorization, backup, or any realistic expectation of survival. Her radio crackled with multiple competing transmissions. Kandahar Tower was trying to raise her on every available frequency. She could hear Hastings's voice, tight with fury, demanding she turn back immediately. Other voices chimed in, operations officers, other pilots, even what sounded like a general from regional command. Tasha switched to a secondary frequency that she knew was monitored, but less actively controlled. She needed to focus on the mission, not on the firestorm she'd left behind. The terrain below shifted from flat desert to foothills, then to the dramatic mountain ranges that made this region so tactically challenging. She'd flown these approaches dozens of times, but always in daylight, always with full support, always with the knowledge that if something went wrong, help was available. Today she had none of those advantages. The weather was deteriorating faster than forecast models had predicted. Dark clouds were building over the mountain peaks, and her instruments showed wind shear warnings that would normally be cause to scrub any mission. 23 minutes into the flight, a new voice came over her radio. This one was different, calmer, more measured. Cargo 7, this is Colonel Patricia Sanderson, Air Combat Command. Captain Brennan, I know you can hear me. I need you to respond. Tasha felt her throat tighten. Colonel Sanderson, the woman who'd approved her transfer application, who'd been building programs to support female aviators facing exactly the kind of discrimination Tasha had endured. The last person she wanted to disappoint. She keyed her microphone. This is Cargo 7, I'm here, Colonel. Captain, I want you to listen very carefully. I understand why you're doing this. I understand the frustration, the anger, the desire to prove yourself. But what you're doing right now will destroy not just your career, but potentially the progress we've made for every female aviator in this military. The words hit harder than Hastings's threats had. Ma'am, there are 540 soldiers dying in that valley. I know. I've been in the command briefings. I've seen the same intelligence you have. And I'm telling you, as someone who's flown combat missions you can't even imagine, that what you're attempting is suicide. The terrain, the weather, the enemy positions, It's not a question of skill or courage. It's mathematics. The probability of success is effectively zero. Then why isn't anyone else trying? There was a pause. Because experienced combat commanders know when a situation is unrecoverable. Because sometimes the hardest decision a leader makes is accepting that some people can't be saved. Because throwing more lives away doesn't honor the ones already lost. Tasha checked her navigation display. She was 17 minutes from Telmer Valley. The point of no return was rapidly approaching, not just tactically, but in every possible sense. Colonel, with respect. Those experienced combat commanders wrote off these soldiers without seriously evaluating alternatives. They looked at the standard approaches, saw the obvious problems, and quit. They didn't consider unconventional solutions, because unconventional thinking isn't rewarded in our system. And you think you're the exception? You think you've found the solution that everyone else missed? I think I have skills that everyone else has ignored. I think I've prepared for this exact scenario while everyone was telling me I'd never need those skills. And I think 540 human beings deserve someone who's willing to try, even if the odds are terrible. Another pause, longer this time. When Sanderson spoke again, her voice had changed subtly. If you survive this, Captain, you will face court-martial. There will be no protection, no special consideration. What you're doing is a fundamental violation of military discipline. I understand, ma'am, but Sanderson drew the word out. If you're going to do this, you should know that intelligence has updated. The battalion's defensive perimeter has contracted to the southern end of the valley. That's where they're concentrated, and that's where you'll need to land if you're going to extract anyone. Tasha felt something shift. Sanderson was giving her tactical information, helping her despite the official condemnation. The southern end puts me closer to the enemy positions on the eastern ridge. Yes, it does. But it also means you'll have the battalion's remaining heavy weapons, providing covering fire during your approach. They've been rationing ammunition, but they'll have enough for one sustained barrage if they know you're coming. How do I communicate with them? Their main comms are down. Switch to frequency 7-7-4-5. It's their emergency backup channel. Quality is poor, but it works. The officer in command is Major Garrett Shaw. Good man, smart tactician. If anyone down there can coordinate an extraction under these conditions, it's him. Tasha quickly adjusted her radio. Colonel, why are you helping me? Sanderson's response was quiet, but fierce. Because I've spent 25 years in this military watching talented people, especially talented women, get sidelined by commanders who valued conformity over capability. Because the system that's court-martialing you tomorrow is the same system that should have given you this mission officially. And because someone needs to prove that the rules that seem immutable can be challenged. The transmission ended. Tasha switched to the frequency Sanderson had provided. Ground Victor 2-3, this is Cargo 7 inbound for emergency extraction. Do you copy? Static filled her headset for several long seconds. Then a voice emerged, rough and exhausted, but unmistakably military. Cargo 7, this is Major Shaw. Please confirm, are you actually inbound to our position? Affirmative, Ground Victor. EDA 12 minutes. I'm going to need your help making this work. Cargo 7. Shaw's voice cracked slightly. Command told us no extraction was possible. They said we were on our own. Command was wrong. Major, I'm going to need you to mark your defensive perimeter with smoke. Prepare your wounded for immediate loading. And be ready to provide suppressive fire on the eastern ridge positions during my approach. There was disbelief in Shaw's response. You're going to land in this valley? In these conditions? With enemy positions on every high point? That's the plan. Can your people support it? Captain, I don't know who you are or how you got clearance for this, but yes. Yes, we can support it. What do you need? Tasha began outlining her approach plan, speaking rapidly as the mountains grew larger ahead of her. She explained how she would use the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible moment, how she needed the smoke markers placed to give her visual references in the deteriorating visibility, how the suppressive fire needed to be timed precisely to keep enemy heads down during her most vulnerable moments. Shaw asked intelligent questions, and Tasha found herself impressed by his tactical acumen. This was someone who understood how to coordinate complex operations under pressure. If he'd made mistakes that led to the battalion's current predicament, they weren't obvious in his current thinking. "One more thing, Major," Tasha added. "I'm operating solo. No co-pilot, no loadmaster, no crew. When I touch down, your people will need to handle all loading operations. I'll keep the engines running, but you'll have maybe 3 minutes to get everyone aboard before enemy forces adjust to our position." 3 minutes for 540 people? Shaw sounded incredulous. "Not all of them. I can take maybe 180 at maximum capacity. You're going to need to prioritize critical wounded first, then as many ambulatory personnel as possible. The rest—" Tasha's voice caught. "Major, I'm sorry, but the rest will have to wait for a second trip. A second trip through that approach? Captain, you won't survive a second trip. Then we better make this first one count. Start preparing your loading teams. Cargo 7 out." Tasha reduced altitude, beginning her approach to the valley. Through gaps in the clouds, she could see the terrain below, steep ridgelines covered with vegetation, rocky outcroppings that could hide dozens of enemy positions, and the narrow valley floor where 540 soldiers waited. Her tactical display showed enemy position markers based on the most recent intelligence. They dominated the high ground, exactly as Foster had described. Any conventional approach would expose her aircraft to concentrated fire from multiple directions. But Tasha wasn't planning a conventional approach. She'd spent months studying unconventional aviation tactics, including techniques used by bush pilots in extreme terrain and combat aviators in Vietnam, who'd pioneered low-level insertion methods. She'd run simulations of precisely this kind of scenario, even though everyone told her she'd never need such skills. The key was using the terrain itself as protection. If she came in low, following the contours of the valley walls, she could minimize her exposure time to the ridge positions. It meant flying dangerously close to terrain at high speed with limited visibility, threading through a gap that left almost no margin for error, the kind of flying that Hastings and every other commander at Kandahar insisted she wasn't capable of. 5 minutes from the valley entrance, Tasha descended to barely 200 feet above the ground, weaving between mountain peaks that rose on either side. The clouds were thickening, reducing visibility to less than 2 miles. Her instruments showed wind gusts approaching dangerous limits for aircraft operations. She activated her tactical radio. "Ground Victor, Cargo 7 is 3 minutes out. Mark your positions now." "Roger." Cargo 7, popping smoke. Ahead, through the haze, Tasha saw columns of colored smoke rising from the valley floor, purple on the northern end of the defensive perimeter, orange on the southern end where she needed to land. She also saw the muzzle flashes from enemy positions on the ridges. They'd spotted her approach and were already engaging. Tracer rounds arced through the air, appearing as bright lines in her peripheral vision. Most were going wide. They hadn't ranged her accurately yet, but it was only a matter of time before they adjusted their aim. "Ground Victor, I need suppressive fire on grid coordinates." Tasha rattled off the positions of the most threatening enemy concentrations. "Everything you've got right now." The response was immediate. The battalion's remaining heavy machine guns and mortar opened up, pouring fire onto the ridge positions. It wouldn't eliminate the threat, but it would force enemy fighters to take cover. Buying her precious seconds of reduced fire, Tasha pushed the C-130 into a steep bank, diving toward the valley entrance. The aircraft shuddered as wind gusts slammed into it from multiple directions. Alarm systems began chirping warnings about terrain proximity. Wind shear, excessive descent rate. She ignored them all. Her hands steady on the controls, her eyes fixed on the narrow corridor ahead. The valley walls rose on either side, so close she could see individual trees. The landing zone was straight ahead, marked by orange smoke that was being shredded by wind gusts. Enemy fire intensified. Something struck the aircraft's fuselage with a metallic bang. More impacts followed. The right engine temperature gauge jumped, indicating possible damage. 200 feet. 150 feet. 100 feet. The landing zone rushed toward her. Tasha could see soldiers running, could see the wounded laid out on makeshift stretchers, could see faces turned upward in disbelief that someone was actually coming. She pulled back on the controls, flaring the aircraft to bleed off speed. The C-130 shuddered, hanging on the edge of a stall. The main gear touched down hard, bouncing once before settling. She reversed the props and applied maximum braking, the runway distance disappearing at an alarming rate. The aircraft slowed, stopped, and turned. Tasha dropped the rear ramp while keeping the engines at minimum power for quick departure. Through her mirrors, she saw soldiers pouring toward the aircraft, carrying wounded, supporting each other. Moving with desperate speed. Major Shaw's voice came over the radio. Cargo 7, we're loading now. Enemy forces repositioning for better firing angles. You've got maybe 2 minutes before this position becomes untenable. Tasha watched the seconds tick by, her right hand on the throttles, ready to go the instant she had clearance. Bullets pinged off the aircraft's skin. An explosion, probably a mortar round, detonated 50 meters away, close enough to rock the C-130 on its landing gear. The rear compartment was filling with soldiers, wounded being placed on the floor, others packing in shoulder to shoulder. There was no time for careful loading procedures or weight distribution calculations. Cargo 7, that's all we can fit, Shaw called. We're at 183 personnel, including wounded. You need to go now. Roger, closing ramp. All personnel clear the rear. The ramp began rising. Through it, Tasha could see the faces of soldiers being left behind, watching the aircraft that could only save a third of their number. Shaw appeared at the cockpit door, his uniform torn and blood-stained. Captain, I'm staying. You need someone up here who knows what the hell is happening. Tasha didn't have time to argue. Strap in and hold on. This takeoff is going to be rough. She pushed the throttles forward. The overloaded C-130 began rolling, picking up speed agonizingly slowly. The valley walls loomed ahead, with barely enough room for the climb out she needed. Enemy fire was reaching a crescendo now. Multiple impacts struck the fuselage. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel. The aircraft lifted off, clearing the ground by mere feet. Tasha held it low, building speed before attempting to climb. The valley walls were converging, forcing her into a narrow corridor with terrain rising on all sides. Come on, she whispered to the aircraft. Come on, you can do this. The C-130 clawed for altitude, engines screaming. They cleared the ridge by less than 100 feet, enemy tracers following them as they emerged from the valley. Only then did Tasha allow herself to breathe. They'd done it. Against every prediction, against every tactical assessment, against all odds, they'd gotten 183 soldiers out of that death trap. But as she set course, back toward Kandahar, she looked at Shaw's exhausted face and thought about the 357 soldiers still in that valley. Still dying, still waiting for rescue that might never come. Her mission wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The flight back to Kandahar should have felt like victory. But Tasha's mind was already calculating the impossible mathematics of a second run. Behind her in the cargo bay, medics who'd been among the rescued were working frantically on the most critically wounded. She could hear their urgent voices, the occasional cry of pain, the steady rhythm of emergency medical procedures being performed in the cramped, vibrating space of her aircraft. Major Shaw had strapped himself into the co-pilot's seat, his face gray with exhaustion and something that looked like guilt. He stared at the instrument panel without really seeing it. 357 still down there, he said quietly. Including my executive officer, Captain Linda Ortiz, best combat leader I've ever worked with. I left her in command of the remaining forces. We got 183 out, Tasha replied, her eyes scanning the damage indicators that were lighting up across her console. The right engine was running hot, hydraulic pressure was fluctuating, and something in the left wing had taken damage that was affecting her control surfaces. That's 183 people who'd be dead right now if I hadn't come. And you're going back? It wasn't a question. Tasha adjusted her heading, compensating for the damaged controls. How much ammunition does Captain Ortiz have left? Maybe enough for one more defensive stand like the one we just did. After that, Shaw didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The radio crackled with a transmission from Kandahar approach. Cargo 7, you are ordered to proceed directly to runway 27. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Upon landing, you will shut down all systems and await security escort. Do not attempt to refuel or rearm. Acknowledge. Tasha keyed her microphone. Kandahar approach. Cargo 7 acknowledges emergency landing. Be advised I have 183 personnel aboard, including critical wounded. Medical teams should be prioritized over security. Cargo 7, medical teams are standing by. Security protocols remain in effect. You are to remain with your aircraft after landing. Shaw looked at her. They're going to arrest you the moment we touch down. Probably. But those 183 people behind us are going home. That's worth whatever comes next. Is it worth the 357 we left behind? The question hung in the air between them. Tasha had no answer that didn't sound either callous or naive. 20 minutes later, the C-130 crossed the perimeter fence at Kandahar Airbase. True to the tower's word, emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway, ambulances, fire trucks, and several military police. Vehicles with lights flashing. Tasha brought the damaged aircraft down with a landing that was rougher than she would have liked but better than the aircraft's conditions should have allowed. As the plane rolled to a stop on the taxiway, medical personnel swarmed the rear ramp before it had fully lowered. Through her cockpit window, she could see Lieutenant Colonel Hastings approaching, flanked by military police officers. His face was a mask of barely controlled fury. Captain Brennan, Shaw said suddenly, before they take you into custody, I want you to know something. What you did today, flying into that valley, executing that approach, getting those people out, I've been in this military for 19 years, and I've never seen flying like that. Whatever happens next, you saved 183 lives that everyone else had written off. That matters. Tell that to the 357 we left behind. I will. Right after I tell them that you're coming back for them. Tasha turned to look at him sharply. Major, I'm about to be arrested. They're not going to let me anywhere near an aircraft. Shaw allowed himself a grim smile. Captain, you just stole a military aircraft, disobeyed direct orders, and flew an unauthorized combat mission. You think they can make your situation any worse by you telling them you plan to do it again? Before Tasha could respond, her cockpit door opened. Hastings climbed up, his eyes blazing with anger. Captain Brennan, you are under arrest for theft of military property, disobeying direct orders, unauthorized combat operations, and reckless endangerment. You will exit this aircraft immediately and surrender yourself to military police custody. Tasha unbuckled her harness and stood, maintaining eye contact with Hastings. Sir, I need to report aircraft damage and request immediate maintenance for a second extraction mission." Hastings actually laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Second mission? You think there's going to be a second mission? Captain, your career is over. You're going to spend the next several years in a military prison. The only thing you need to be thinking about right now is how to minimize the consequences of what you've done." "Sir, there are still 357 soldiers in Telmer Valley. I'm aware of how many soldiers are in Telmer Valley. Captain, that number is not your concern anymore. You are relieved of all duties, effective immediately. And please, take her into custody." Two military police officers stepped forward, but Major Shaw moved between them and Tasha. "Colonel Hastings, with respect, before you arrest Captain Brennan, you should know that she just accomplished what you and every other officer at this base said was impossible. She flew into hostile territory, under fire, in deteriorating weather conditions, and extracted 183 personnel. I was there. I watched her thread that aircraft through terrain that would have killed anyone with less skill. Major Shaw, your battalion is in its current position because of tactical failures. My battalion is in its current position because intelligence was flawed and enemy strength was underestimated." Shaw interrupted, his voice hardening. "But my battalion is going to survive because one pilot had the courage to try when everyone else gave up. Sir, if you arrest her right now, you're sending a message to every soldier in this theater that their lives don't matter when the mission gets difficult. I'm sending a message that military discipline matters, that orders matter, that we don't reward reckless." "Reckless?" Shaw's voice rose. "Colonel, I've commanded combat operations for 6 years. What Captain Brennan did today wasn't reckless. It was the most precisely calculated, expertly executed combat aviation I've ever witnessed. She used terrain masking that I didn't think was possible in that valley. She timed her approach to our defensive fire perfectly. She landed and took off from a hot LZ in conditions that should have been impossible. That's not recklessness. That's exceptional skill combined with extraordinary courage." A small crowd had gathered, medical personnel, ground crew, other pilots who'd come to see what the commotion was about. Tasha could see Lieutenant Reeves among them, the young pilot who'd created the distraction that allowed her to take off. Hastings looked around at the watching faces and seemed to realize he was losing control of the narrative. "Major Shaw, I understand you're grateful to Captain Brennan, but gratitude doesn't change the facts. She violated direct orders, stole military property. She saved 183 lives," Shaw interrupted again. "Lives that you had decided weren't worth saving." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Hastings's face flushed red. "I made a tactical assessment based on the best available intelligence. You made a calculation that 540 soldiers were acceptable losses," Tasha said quietly. "That's not a tactical assessment, sir. That's a decision about whose lives have value and whose don't." "How dare you?" "Sir, I'll accept whatever punishment you think is appropriate. Court-martial me, discharge me, put me in prison. But before you do any of that, authorize a second extraction mission. Use a different pilot if you don't trust me. Use different aircraft. But get the rest of those soldiers out of that valley before the weather closes in completely." Hastings stared at her, his jaw working. "There is no second mission, Captain. The weather window has closed. Those soldiers' only option now is to hold position and hope for diplomatic resolution or wait for the weather to clear." "They don't have time to wait for the weather to clear," Shaw interjected. "With reduced ammunition and no resupply, they'll be overrun within 24 hours. Then they'll have to hold out as long as they can," Hastings said, his voice dropping to something almost sad. "Major, I wish there was another option. But Captain Brennan used up our one chance. The element of surprise is gone. Enemy forces know we're attempting extraction. They'll be ready for any follow-up attempt. Sending another aircraft into that valley now would be suicide with no reasonable expectation of success. Tasha felt something cold settle in her stomach. He was right about the tactical situation changing. Her first run had worked partly because the enemy hadn't expected it. A second attempt would face a prepared, reinforced defense, but that didn't change the fundamental reality. 357 soldiers were still dying in that valley. "Sir," she said slowly, "what if we changed the approach? Instead of going in during daylight, wait until dark. Use night vision equipment. Come in from a different direction. Captain, you are under arrest. You don't get to plan missions anymore." Hastings gestured to the MPs. "Take her to the detention facility. Major Shaw, you'll need to report to medical for evaluation and then to debriefing. Everyone else, return to your duties. This situation is over." As the military police officer stepped forward again, Tasha caught sight of someone pushing through the crowd. Colonel Patricia Sanderson, the officer who'd helped her with tactical information during her unauthorized flight, emerged with an expression that suggested she'd just arrived from somewhere far away at high speed. "Lieutenant Colonel Hastings." "Hold on a moment," Sanderson called out, her voice carrying clear authority despite not raising it. "Before you proceed with that arrest, I need a word." Hastings turned, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. "Colonel Sanderson? I wasn't aware you were at Kandahar. I wasn't. I arrived 10 minutes ago on a priority transport from command." Sanderson walked up to where they stood, her eyes sweeping across Tasha, Shaw, and Hastings. "I've been monitoring this situation since Captain Brennan took off this morning. I need to speak with her privately before any arrest proceedings." "Ma'am, with respect, Captain Brennan is already under arrest for." "I'm aware of what she's under arrest for, Colonel. I'm also aware that she just accomplished an extraction that your entire command structure declared impossible. I'm also aware that there are still 357 soldiers in Telmer Valley who are going to die if we don't act quickly." Sanderson's voice hardened. "Now I'm not asking for permission, Lieutenant Colonel. I'm telling you that I need to speak with Captain Brennan immediately. And your arrest procedures can wait 15 minutes. Hastings looked like he wanted to argue but seemed to recognize that. Sanderson outranked him and carried authority that extended beyond the local command structure. 15 minutes, Colonel. Then she goes into custody." Sanderson nodded and gestured for Tasha to follow her. They walked toward a quiet area near the maintenance hangars, out of earshot of the crowd. Once they were alone, Sanderson turned to face her. "Captain Brennan, I'm going to be direct with you. What you did today was simultaneously the bravest and most foolish thing I've seen in 25 years of military service. Yes, ma'am. You saved 183 lives. You also threw away your career, guaranteed yourself a court-martial, and potentially set back progress for female aviators by decades. Every critic who's ever said women are too emotional, too reckless, too undisciplined for combat roles is going to point to you as proof." Tasha felt those words like physical blows. "Ma'am, I didn't think about." "No, you didn't. You thought about the immediate situation and ignored everything else." Sanderson paused. "Which is exactly what a combat aviator should do. The people who are going to condemn you for what you did today are the same people who would have condemned you for doing nothing. You were in an impossible situation with no good options. Ma'am, I need to ask you something. Is there any way to get authorization for a second extraction? Any option at all?" Sanderson looked at her for a long moment. "Officially? No. The theater commander has classified the Telmer Valley situation as a lost cause. No further aviation assets will be committed. The official position is that we're pursuing diplomatic channels for the remaining personnel. And unofficially? Unofficially, there's a rumor circulating at very senior levels that a certain captain who's facing court-martial might attempt another unauthorized flight. If such a thing were to happen, and I'm not suggesting it will, there might be resources positioned to support such an attempt. Refueling equipment in locations that aren't typically staffed at night. Maintenance crews who might happen to work late this evening. That sort of thing. Tasha stared at her. Ma'am, are you saying? I'm not saying anything, Captain. I'm simply noting that security at Kandahar Airbase becomes much less rigorous after dark. And that certain people in positions of authority believe that extraordinary circumstances sometimes require extraordinary responses. Sanderson glanced at her watch. You should also know that Major Shaw has requested to accompany any potential second extraction attempt. Apparently, he feels responsible for the soldiers still in that valley. Colonel, if I'm caught attempting a second unauthorized flight, then you'll face additional charges on top of what you're already facing. But Captain, you're already looking at significant prison time. What's a few more charges in the grand scheme of things? Sanderson's expression softened slightly. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same. Sometimes you have to choose which matters more. Before Tasha could respond, Sanderson straightened and spoke more loudly, clearly aware that people might be within earshot. Captain Brennan, I want to be clear that I am not authorizing any further unauthorized actions. Any additional violations of military regulations will be prosecuted to the fullest extent. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Tasha replied, understanding perfectly what Sanderson was really saying. Good. Now, I believe Lieutenant Colonel Hastings is waiting to place you in detention. Sanderson leaned in close and dropped her voice to barely a whisper. Detention Cell 3 has a faulty lock mechanism. Has for weeks. Maintenance keeps forgetting to fix it. Terrible security risk. Then she stepped back and walked away, leaving Tasha standing alone with a decision that would define the rest of her life. The military police officers escorted her to the detention facility, a small building on the edge of the base. As promised, she was placed in Cell 3, a Spartan room with a cot, a sink, and a door with a lock that looked solid but felt loose when the MPs closed it behind her. Tasha sat on the cot and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing through calculations. Sunset was in 4 hours. Full darkness would come within 5 hours. The weather window would be completely closed by midnight, meaning she'd have maybe a 5-hour window to attempt a second extraction, if she was going to try. If the word felt almost laughable. There was no if about it. From the moment she'd seen those 357 faces staring at her aircraft as it took off, she'd known she was going back. The only question was whether she could pull it off. Her damaged C-130 was probably already in maintenance, being repaired by crews who might, if Sanderson's hints were accurate, work just slowly enough that the aircraft wouldn't be operational until after dark, she thought. About the faces of the soldiers she'd rescued. About Major Shaw's guilt-ridden expression. About the voice of Captain Ortiz that she'd never heard, but who was apparently still down there leading. Soldiers who'd been abandoned by their own command. She thought about her letter to Colonel Sanderson, still sitting on her desk in her quarters, explaining why she'd made the choice she'd made, and she thought about the question Shaw had asked. Was saving 183 worth, leaving 357 behind? The answer was obvious. She was going back. Not because it would change the outcome of her court-martial or salvage her career. Not because it would prove anything to Hastings or anyone else who'd underestimated her. She was going back because 357 human beings were counting on someone to try. Even if that someone was a disgraced captain facing prison time. Flying a damaged aircraft into impossible conditions for a mission that everyone saw it couldn't be done. Tasha stood up and walked to the cell door. As Sanderson had indicated, the lock was faulty. With minimal effort, she could open it from the inside, but not yet. She needed to wait for darkness. Needed to time this perfectly. She returned to the cot and closed her eyes, forcing herself to rest for the impossible mission ahead. Darkness fell over. Kandahar Airbase at 1947 hours. Tasha had been watching the light fade through the small window of her detention cell, counting down the minutes until conditions would be optimal for what she was about to attempt. Her body ached from the day's exertion, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline that hadn't fully dissipated. But her mind was sharp and focused. At 20:15 hours, she tested the faulty lock again. It gave way with minimal pressure, exactly as Colonel Sanderson had suggested it would. Tasha eased the door open and peered into the corridor. The detention facility was minimally staffed at night, just one guard at the front desk, and from the sound of it, he was occupied with paperwork or perhaps nodding off. She moved silently down the hallway in the opposite direction, toward the emergency exit that maintenance crews used. The exit alarm had been disabled weeks ago, another maintenance issue that apparently hadn't been prioritized for repair. The night air hit her face as she slipped outside. The base was quieter now, with only essential operations continuing. Most personnel were either asleep or in the recreation facilities. Perfect conditions for someone who needed to move unseen. Tasha made her way toward the flight line, keeping to shadows and utilizing paths she'd learned over 8 years of early morning arrivals. She knew every camera location, every patrol route, every blind spot in the base's security network. As she approached Hangar 7, she saw exactly what Sanderson had hinted at. Work lights were on, and the sounds of maintenance activity echoed in the night. Her C-130 sat in the hangar bay, surrounded by equipment and crew members who were working with an intensity that seemed unusual for routine repairs. Technical Sergeant Mills spotted her first. He looked up from a hydraulic system he was inspecting, his expression carefully neutral. "Captain Brennan, I heard you were in detention." "I was." The lock was faulty. Tasha walked closer, examining her aircraft. "What's the status?" Mills exchanged glances with the other crew members working nearby. "Officially, this aircraft is down for maintenance and won't be operational until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." "And unofficially?" "Unofficially, we've been working on priority repairs. Right engine is fixed. Hydraulics are restored. Control surface damage has been patched. We've also taken the liberty of loading extra fuel tanks and some equipment that wasn't on your manifest for the first run." Mills gestured toward the cargo bay. "Night vision gear, additional medical supplies, emergency rations. The kind of things you might need for an extended operation." Tasha felt her throat tighten. "Mills, if you help me with this, you could face charges. Ma'am, with respect, some of us have been watching you get dismissed and underestimated for 8 years. Some of us think it's about time someone recognized what you're actually capable of." He pulled out a tablet showing the aircraft's system status. "Everything checks out. She's ready to fly if someone were hypothetically planning an unauthorized departure." Another figure emerged from behind the aircraft. Major Shaw, now wearing a flight suit instead of his combat uniform, carrying a helmet and survival gear. "Major, what are you doing here?" Tasha asked. "Going with you. Those are my people still in that valley, and I'm not sitting on the sidelines for the second extraction." Shaw's expression left no room for argument. "Plus, you need a co-pilot. That aircraft is designed for a crew, and you're going to need all the help you can get on this run. Shaw, you just got out of a combat zone. You should be in medical." "I was in medical. They cleared me. Minor injuries, nothing that affects my ability to function." He stepped closer. "Captain, I know what you're risking by going back. But you're not doing it alone. I've already coordinated with Captain Ortiz on the ground. She knows we're coming. She's prepared a different landing zone, further from enemy concentrations. It's riskier terrain, but potentially less exposure to direct fire." Tasha wanted to argue, to protect Shaw from the consequences that were inevitable if they got caught. But she also knew he was right. She needed help. And having someone who understood the ground situation could mean the difference between success and failure. Fine, but we do this my way, following my flight plan and my tactical decisions. Understood? Understood. Mills approached with a clipboard. If you two are going, you should leave in the next 20 minutes. Guard change happens at 2200, and the new security team is less flexible about protocol violations. Tasha turned to the crew chief. Mills, why are you doing this? You could lose your career. Mills smiled slightly. Ma'am, my brother was Army infantry. Got pinned down in a similar situation 3 years ago in a different theater. Command wrote his unit off as lost. A Marine pilot disobeyed orders, flew into a hot zone, and got them out. My brother came home because someone decided orders mattered less than lives. He handed her the clipboard. Sign off on the maintenance inspection. Make it official that this aircraft is airworthy. As Tasha signed the documents, she noticed other crew members approaching: fuel technicians, armaments specialists, communications techs. They worked in coordinated silence, preparing the C-130 for departure with an efficiency that spoke of careful pre-planning. Lieutenant Reeves appeared from the shadows near the hangar entrance. Captain, I'm monitoring security frequencies. You've got a clear window for the next 18 minutes. After that, the patrol route brings guards past this hangar. Reeves, you should go. You've already helped enough. I'm not leaving until you're airborne, ma'am. Someone needs to keep watch. The young pilot's voice was firm. What you did today inspired a lot of us. We're not letting you face this alone. At 2,143 hours, Tasha and Shaw climbed into the cockpit. The instrument panels glowed in the darkness, familiar and comforting despite the circumstances. Shaw settled into the co-pilot's seat, running through pre-flight checks with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Systems green across the board, he reported. Fuel tanks full, including the auxiliary tanks Mills installed. That gives us extended range if we need alternate routes. Tasha began her engine start sequence, the turbines winding up with their characteristic whine. Through the cockpit window, she could see Mills and his crew moving away from the aircraft. Their work complete. Kandahar Tower, this is Cargo 7 requesting departure clearance, she said into her radio. Knowing full well what response she'd get, there was a long silence. Then a voice she recognized as belonging to one of the senior controllers. Cargo 7. Am I understanding correctly that you're requesting clearance? Affirmative, Tower. Emergency extraction mission to Talmer Valley. Requesting immediate departure. Another pause. Cargo 7, please stand by. Shaw looked at her. They're scrambling security right now. We've got maybe 2 minutes before this place is swarming with MPs. Then we better not wait for clearance. Tasha released the brakes and began taxiing toward the runway, not bothering with the usual slow, methodical approach. She pushed the throttles forward, accelerating the heavily loaded aircraft faster than safety regulations recommended. Cargo 7, you are ordered to stop immediately. The tower controller's voice had changed, sharper, more urgent. Unauthorized departure, return to hangar immediately. Through her side window, Tasha could see vehicle lights converging on the flight line. Security forces racing to intercept her before she could take off. She reached the runway threshold and didn't pause for final checks. The C-130 surged forward, engines roaring at full power. The runway lights blurred past as the aircraft accelerated. Cargo 7, this is Lieutenant Colonel Hastings. Stop now, or we will take measures to prevent your departure. Shaw glanced at her. What measures? They going to shoot us down? Let's not find out. Tasha pulled back on the controls. The C-130 lifted off with room to spare, climbing into the night sky as vehicle lights converged on the spot. where they'd been seconds before. The radio exploded with competing transmissions. Hastings screaming orders. Security forces reporting the unauthorized departure. Operations officers demanding explanations. Tasha switched to a different frequency, tuning out the chaos. "Well," Shaw said dryly, "I think we can safely say your first court-martial just got a lot more complicated. Focus on navigation. We're taking a different approach route than this morning. I want to come in from the northwest, using this ridgeline for terrain masking." She brought up the tactical map on her display. "What's the status with Captain Ortiz?" Shaw switched to the emergency frequency they'd used earlier. "Ground Victor, this is Cargo 7. We're inbound, ETA 42 minutes. Confirm landing zone status." The response came through with heavy static. "Cargo 7, this is Ortiz. We've marked the alternate LZ with infrared strobes. Be advised, enemy has reinforced positions since your last extraction. They're expecting you." "Understood. Can you provide suppressive fire on approach?" "Negative. We expended most of our heavy ammunition covering your departure this morning. We've got small arms and 2 mortar with limited rounds. It won't be enough to keep them suppressed for long." Shaw cursed quietly. "Captain, this is even worse than the first run. They're ready for us, we have less covering fire, and we're attempting a night landing in terrain we've barely reconnoitered." "Which is exactly why they won't expect us to actually try it," Tasha replied. "Everyone knows it's impossible, so their defenses will be set up for what they think is possible. And if they're wrong? If they do anticipate our approach? Then we improvise." Tasha adjusted their heading, beginning the descent toward the mountain ranges. "Shaw, I need you to coordinate with Ortiz on exact timing. The moment they hear our engines, enemy forces will start repositioning. We'll have maybe 90 seconds between when we're detected and when we're in their optimal firing range. As they approach the mountains." Tasha descended to dangerously low altitude, using terrain to mask their approach. The night vision system showed the landscape in eerie green monochrome ridgelines, valleys, scattered vegetation that could hide enemy positions. "Cargo 7 Ortiz, we have visual on enemy movement. They're anticipating an approach from the same direction as this morning." "Copy that. We're coming from the northwest. 60 seconds to visual range." Shaw was handling communications and navigation, leaving Tasha free to focus entirely on flying. The narrow mountain pass ahead required absolute precision. One miscalculation, and they'd slam into terrain with no time to recover. The C-130 threaded through the pass, wings tilting as she banked around obstacles. Warning systems screamed about terrain proximity, but she'd disabled the most insistent alarms to reduce cockpit distractions. 30 seconds to the valley, Shaw reported. Ortiz confirms infrared strobes are active. Through the night vision display, Tasha could see the valley opening ahead. And she could see the muzzle flashes from enemy positions, far more numerous than intelligence had indicated. They'd reinforced significantly since the morning extraction. "Ground Victor, we're coming in hot. I need whatever fire support you can give me right now." The response was immediate. Tracer fire arced up from the battalion's defensive position, targeting the nearest enemy concentrations. It wasn't enough to suppress them, but it forced some of the fighters to take cover. Tasha dove toward the valley floor, dropping altitude so rapidly that both she and Shaw were pressed back in their seats by the G-forces. The infrared strobes marking the landing zone appeared on her display, a section of terrain that looked impossibly rough for a landing. Enemy fire intensified as they realized where she was heading. Rounds impacted the fuselage with metallic cracks. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. "Left engine temperature spiking," Shaw called out. "We're taking damage." "I know." "Hold on." She flared the aircraft, bleeding off speed in a maneuver that pushed the C-130's specifications to their absolute limits. The landing gear touched down hard on uneven terrain, bouncing violently. Tasha fought the controls, keeping them straight as rocks and debris pelted the underside of the fuselage. They slowed, turned, and dropped the rear ramp. Through her mirror, Tasha could see soldiers emerging from defensive positions, moving toward the aircraft with desperate speed. These were the ones who'd waited all day wondering if anyone would come back for them. "Ortiz, we've got maybe 90 seconds before enemy forces adjust," Shaw transmitted. "Everyone who can move needs to move now." The cargo bay filled with soldiers, faster than the morning extraction, because everyone knew exactly what to do this time. No hesitation, no wasted movement. Just survival instinct driving them forward. An explosion detonated close enough to rock the aircraft on its landing gear. Another explosion, closer still. Enemy mortar had found their range. "Cargo 7, that's everyone," Ortiz's voice came through. "We're at 178 personnel. Closing ramp now." The ramp began rising. Tasha didn't wait for it to fully close before advancing the throttles. The overloaded C-130 began rolling forward, picking up speed on the rough terrain that threatened to tear apart the landing gear. "Come on," she whispered, watching the airspeed indicator climb with agonizing slowness. "Come on, fly." The aircraft lifted off just as a mortar round detonated exactly where they'd been parked. Tasha held the aircraft low, building speed before attempting to climb out of the valley. Then the left engine exploded. The C-130 shuddered violently, yawing hard to the left. Warning systems went into full alarm mode. Through her window, Tasha could see flames streaming from the engine nacelle. "Fire in engine 1!" Shaw shouted, already reaching for the engine shutdown controls. "Activating suppression system." Tasha fought the controls, compensating for the asymmetric thrust that was trying to force them into a deadly spiral. With one engine out and the aircraft massively overloaded, they didn't have enough power to climb out of the valley through the route she'd planned. "Ground Victor. We've lost an engine and we're critically damaged," Shaw transmitted. "We're not going to make it through the standard exit route." Tasha's mind raced through alternatives. The valley walls rose on 3 sides, each one impossible for a damaged, overloaded aircraft to clear. But straight ahead, through the narrowest part of the valley where the terrain was most treacherous, there was a gap that might, just barely might, be wide enough. "Strap in and brace everyone in the cargo bay," she ordered Shaw. "I'm taking the low route." "Captain, that gap is barely, I know what it is. Tell Ortiz to secure everything and everyone. This is going to be rough." She pushed the throttles on the remaining engines to maximum, coaxing every bit of thrust possible from systems that were already operating beyond their limits. The valley walls narrowed ahead, closing in like the jaws of a trap. The C-130 raced toward the gap, flames still streaming from the dead engine. Control surfaces responding sluggishly to her commands. The gap looked impossibly small, too narrow for the aircraft's wingspan, but sometimes impossible. Just meant no one had tried hard enough. Tasha banked the aircraft at a severe angle, nearly standing it on one wing. The maneuver bled off precious speed, but allowed the tilted aircraft to fit through the gap that would have been too narrow. For a level approach, the right wingtip cleared the rock wall by less than 3 feet. The left wing passed through the gap with similar minimal clearance. For one breathless moment, they were threading through solid rock with no margin for error. Then they were through, emerging into open air beyond the valley. Tasha rolled the aircraft level and began a gradual climb, nursing the damaged systems. "Ground Victor to Cargo 7, Ortiz's voice came through, shaky with emotion. "That was the most insane flying I've ever seen. How did you even know that gap was there?" "I didn't," Tasha admitted. "I just knew it was our only option." Shaw let out a breath he'd been holding. "Captain Brennan, you just flew a heavily damaged, overloaded transport aircraft through a gap that most fighter pilots wouldn't attempt. On one engine. At night, in hostile territory, was there another option? No, but that doesn't make it any less impossible. As they limped toward Kandahar, fighting to keep the damaged aircraft in the air, Tasha allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. 361 soldiers were now safe 183 from the morning run and 178 from the night extraction. She'd saved them all. Every single person who'd been trapped in that valley was now heading home, and she'd done it by being exactly the kind of pilot everyone said she couldn't be. The crippled C-130 struggled through the night sky, its remaining engines screaming at maximum power just to maintain altitude. Tasha's arms ached from fighting the damaged flight controls, every correction requiring twice the force it should have. The cockpit reeked of burnt hydraulic fluid and electrical smoke, and warning lights painted the instrument panel in urgent reds and ambers. "How's our fuel situation?" she asked Shaw, her voice hoarse from the smoke and tension. Shaw checked the gauges, his expression grim. "Better than it should be, considering. The auxiliary tanks mills installed are intact. We've got enough to make Kandahar with a small reserve." "Small meaning?" "Meaning we get one approach. No go-arounds, no missed approaches. We either land on the first attempt or we run out of fuel trying." Behind them in the cargo bay, Tasha could hear Captain Ortiz coordinating medical care for the wounded. The rescued soldiers were packed in so tightly there was barely room to move. But somehow the medics were managing to provide treatment under impossible conditions. The radio crackled with transmissions from Kandahar approach, their tones shifting from urgent to resigned. "Cargo 7, Kandahar approach. We've been monitoring your situation. Emergency crews are standing by. Are you able to maintain controlled flight?" "Affirmative, Kandahar. Flight controls are compromised but functional. Request priority landing clearance and emergency equipment on runway 27. Cargo 7, you have priority clearance. Be advised that Lieutenant Colonel Hastings has ordered your immediate arrest upon landing. Security forces will take you into custody." Shaw looked at her. "After what you just did, they're still going to arrest you." "I stole a military aircraft, twice. Yeah, they're going to arrest me." Tasha adjusted their heading, beginning the approach to Kandahar. "But 361 soldiers are alive who wouldn't be otherwise. I can live with whatever comes next." The lights of Kandahar Airbase appeared in the distance, a constellation of illumination against the dark desert floor. As they descended, Tasha could see emergency vehicles lining the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and the inevitable military police vehicles with their flashing lights. "Final approach," she called out, lowering the landing gear. The hydraulic system groaned in protest, and only 2 of the 3 gear indicators showed green. "We've got a gear problem. Main gear is down, but I'm not sure about the nose gear. Can you do a flyby for tower to visually confirm?" "Not enough fuel. We're landing regardless of gear status." Tasha focused on the runway threshold, making minute adjustments to keep the damaged aircraft aligned. Every control input felt mushy, delayed, as if the aircraft was fighting her. The runway rose to meet them. Tasha flared, bleeding off speed, praying that the nose gear was actually down despite the uncertain indicator. The main gear touched first, a jarring impact that sent shudders through the entire airframe. The nose gear hit hard. Thankfully it was down, and Tasha reversed the remaining engines, applying maximum braking. The damaged aircraft shuddered and groaned, but stayed on the runway, slowing, finally rolling to a stop. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the cockpit, except for the winding down engines and the various alarm systems still protesting the aircraft's condition. Then Shaw spoke quietly. "Captain Brennan, that was the finest piece of flying I've ever witnessed." Before Tasha could respond, her cockpit door burst open. But instead of military police, Captain Ortiz climbed up, her face streaked with dirt and dried blood. but her eyes fierce with emotion. "Captain Brennan, before they arrest you, I need to say something. I've served under a dozen commanders in my career. Not one of them would have done what you did. Not one would have risked everything to come back for us." Ortiz's voice cracked slightly. "You saved 361 lives today. People with families, with children, with futures. Whatever the military does to you, those of us who were in that valley will never forget that you came when everyone else abandoned us." Through the cockpit window, Tasha could see military police officers approaching, led by Lieutenant Colonel Hastings. But behind them, something unexpected was happening. Soldiers were emerging from the cargo bay, being helped down by medical personnel. And as they realized they were safely on the ground, many were looking toward the cockpit where Tasha sat. One soldier started clapping. Then another. Within moments, dozens of soldiers, exhausted, wounded, barely able to stand, were applauding the pilot who'd saved them. Hastings stopped, staring at the scene with an expression that mixed anger with something that might have been uncertainty. The military police officers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of arresting someone who was being celebrated as a hero by the very soldiers she'd rescued. Colonel Patricia Sanderson appeared, having apparently been waiting for their arrival. She walked directly to Hastings, their conversation inaudible from the cockpit, but their body language speaking volumes. Hastings gestured angrily toward Tasha's aircraft. Sanderson responded with calm authority, pointing toward the rescued soldiers, then toward something in the distance. Finally, Hastings nodded curtly and walked away. Leaving Sanderson to approach the aircraft alone, Tasha climbed down from the cockpit, her legs shaky from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. She expected to be immediately placed in handcuffs, but instead, Sanderson simply looked at her for a long moment. "Captain Brennan, you are under arrest for multiple violations of military regulations, including theft of military property, disobeying direct orders, and unauthorized combat operations." Sanderson's voice was formal, official, but her eyes told a different story. "However, before you're taken into custody, General Robert Patterson has requested to speak with you. He's arriving by helicopter in approximately 15 minutes. "General Patterson? The theater commander?" "The same. Apparently, word of your unauthorized extractions reached his office several hours ago. He's been monitoring the situation personally." Sanderson lowered her voice. "Tasha, what you did today is going to have consequences far beyond your personal situation. You've forced a reckoning with how this military treats orders versus lives, protocol versus conscience." Major Shaw had emerged from the aircraft as well, standing beside Tasha. "Colonel, Captain Brennan should be receiving a medal, not facing arrest." "Major Shaw, in a perfect world, you'd be right. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a military that operates on discipline and chain of command. What Captain Brennan did, twice, was a fundamental violation of that system. That system was going to let 540 soldiers die," Tasha said quietly. "Sir, with respect, if following the system means abandoning people who need help, then maybe the system needs to be challenged." Before Sanderson could respond, the distinctive sound of an approaching helicopter filled the air. A Black Hawk descended toward the airfield, its rotors whipping up dust and debris. It touched down near the operations building, and a tall figure in combat uniform emerged. General Robert Patterson was a legend in military aviation circles, a former fighter pilot who'd commanded combat operations across multiple theaters. He walked toward where Tasha stood, his expression unreadable. "Captain Brennan," he said without preamble, "I've been reviewing the reports from today's events. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Tasha straightened despite her exhaustion. "Sir, I violated direct orders and stole military aircraft to conduct unauthorized rescue operations. I accept full responsibility for my actions and am prepared to face whatever consequences are appropriate. Patterson studied her for a moment. That's not what I asked, Captain. I asked if you have anything to say for yourself. Not about regulations or consequences. About why you did what you did. Tasha met his gaze. Sir, 540 soldiers were going to die. I had the skills and the aircraft to save them. Everyone told me it was impossible, but impossible just meant no one had tried. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least attempt what everyone else had given up on. And when you succeeded the first time, extracting 183 personnel, you decided to go back for the rest. Even though you were in custody, even though the tactical situation had worsened, even though your aircraft was damaged. Yes, sir. Because getting some of them out didn't make it acceptable to abandon the rest. Patterson turned to Major Shaw. Major, you accompanied Captain Brennan on the second extraction. You had just escaped from a combat zone, you'd been wounded, and you voluntarily climbed back into a damaged aircraft to fly into hostile territory. Why? Shaw didn't hesitate. Sir, those were my soldiers. Captain Brennan was the only person willing to try to save them. I wasn't going to let her go alone. And Captain Ortiz, Patterson addressed the ground commander who'd been listening nearby. Your assessment of Captain Brennan's actions? Ortiz stepped forward. Sir, I've been in combat for 11 years. I've seen extraordinary acts of courage, seen soldiers do impossible things under fire. What Captain Brennan did today exceeds anything I've witnessed. The first extraction was brilliant flying under impossible conditions. The second extraction, through that narrow gap with one engine out, that should have been suicide. Somehow she made it work. Patterson nodded slowly, then turned back to Tasha. Captain, do you understand that what you did has created an impossible situation for this command? On one hand, you saved 361 lives through exceptional skill and extraordinary courage. On the other hand, you violated fundamental principles of military discipline that hold this entire organization together. I understand. Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Hastings wants you court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. He's prepared extensive documentation of your violations. He makes valid points about the necessity of maintaining chain of command. Tasha felt her heart sink. She'd known this was coming, but hearing it stated so plainly still hurt. However, Patterson continued, Colonel Sanderson has presented me with equally extensive documentation of your qualifications, your record, and the systematic discrimination you faced that prevented your skills from being properly utilized. She's also presented testimony from the 361 soldiers you rescued, from ground commanders you've supported over 8 years, and from crew chiefs who've worked with you. He pulled out a tablet and activated the screen. I've also reviewed the flight data recorder from your aircraft, the approach vectors you flew, the terrain masking you utilized, the emergency procedures you executed with a damaged aircraft. Captain Brennan, I've been flying for 32 years, and I'm not certain I could have done what you did. Patterson looked around at the assembled personnel, the rescued soldiers, the medical crews, the maintenance staff who'd helped prepare her aircraft, the other pilots who'd gathered to watch. This situation requires a decision that balances military discipline with recognizing exceptional performance under extraordinary circumstances. He turned back to Tasha. Captain Natasha Brennan, you are hereby temporarily relieved of arrest pending a full investigation into today's events. You will remain at Kandahar Airbase and will not operate any aircraft until this investigation is complete. You will provide full testimony about your actions and your decisions, and you will face a formal review board that will determine appropriate consequences. Tasha felt confusion. Sir, I don't understand. Am I being charged or not? That decision is above my pay grade, Captain. What I can tell you is that I'm not going to allow Lieutenant Colonel Hastings railroaded you into a court-martial before all the facts are properly evaluated. Patterson's expression softened slightly. I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions today. Whether that recommendation is approved or not, I want it on record that in my professional opinion, what you accomplished today represents aviation excellence of the highest order. He looked at Hastings, who had returned and was standing nearby with a dark expression. Lieutenant Colonel, you will compile a complete report on today's events, including all factors that led to the Talmer Valley situation. I want to understand why 540 soldiers were in a position to be trapped in the first place, and why initial command assessments concluded extraction was impossible. Hastings's face flushed. Sir, I made tactical assessments based on assumptions that proved to be incorrect, Patterson interrupted. Captain Brennan demonstrated that extraction was possible. That means either our tactical assessment capabilities are flawed, or we're not properly utilizing the full range of skills available in our aviation units. Either way, we have a problem that needs to be addressed. He turned back to address everyone present. Over the next few weeks, there will be extensive discussions about what happened here today. There will be arguments about discipline versus initiative, orders versus conscience, protocol versus results. These are important conversations that this military needs to have. Patterson gestured toward the rescued soldiers, many of whom were being loaded into ambulances. But while we're having those conversations, 361 soldiers are going home to their families. 361 people who were written off as acceptable losses are alive, because one captain decided that orders mattered less than lives. Whatever else we conclude about today's events, that fact remains unchanged. He addressed Tasha directly one more time. Captain, you've created a situation that's going to force some very senior people to make very difficult decisions. I can't promise you what the outcome will be, but I can promise that your actions today will be evaluated fairly, considering all factors. As General Patterson walked back toward his helicopter, the crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Medical personnel continued evacuating the wounded. Maintenance crews began assessing the damaged. 100 to 130. Life on a military base resumed its normal rhythms, but something fundamental had shifted. Tasha could see it in the faces of the other pilots, in the respect on the faces of ground personnel, in the way even the military police officers who were supposed to be guarding her seemed uncertain about their role. Captain Ortiz approached once more, this time with several of her soldiers. Captain Brennan, we're being transferred to medical facilities for evaluation and treatment. Before we go, everyone from the battalion wanted me to give you something. She handed Tasha a small object, a unit patch from the battalion that had been trapped in Talmer Valley, with hundreds of signatures on the back, names of every soldier who'd been rescued. We know you're facing consequences for saving us, Ortiz said. We want you to know that every person who signed that patch will testify on your behalf if needed. We'll tell anyone who asks that you're a hero, not a criminal. As the rescued soldiers were finally taken away for medical care, Tasha stood alone on the tarmac, holding the signed patch and watching the damaged 100 to 130 that had carried them all to safety. She'd thrown away her career, faced certain court-martial, and risked her life multiple times. She'd violated every rule in the book and challenged the fundamental authority, structure of the military. And she'd do it all, again in a heartbeat, because some things were worth more than following orders. Some things were worth more than a career. And 361 human lives were worth any consequence she might face. The sun was beginning to rise over Kandahar Airbase, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold. A new day was beginning, and with it, a reckoning that would determine not just Tasha's fate, but potentially reshape how the military thought about courage, discipline, and what it meant to be a leader. 3 months after the Talmer Valley extractions, Captain Natasha Brennan stood in a hearing room at the Pentagon, facing a review board that would determine the trajectory of the rest of her life. The room was smaller than she'd expected, almost intimate, with 5 senior officers seated behind a long table and a single chair positioned in the center, where she would testify. The weeks leading to this moment had been surreal. She'd been confined to Kandahar initially, giving countless depositions and interviews. News of her unauthorized rescue missions had leaked to the media, creating a firestorm of public attention that military leadership clearly hadn't anticipated. Videos taken by rescued soldiers had gone viral online, shaky footage of her damaged C-130 landing under fire, audio recordings of her calm voice coordinating the extractions while enemy rounds impacted her aircraft. Public opinion had split sharply. Some viewed her as a reckless maverick who'd endangered herself and others through her insubordination. Others saw her as a hero who'd saved lives when the system failed. The debate had raged across news networks, social media, and even in congressional hearings about military culture and decision-making authority. The review board was chaired by General Patricia Hammond, a decorated combat veteran who'd spent 4 decades navigating the complexities of military service. To her left sat Colonel Sanderson, who'd been advocating for Tasha throughout the process. To her right were 3 other senior officers whose expressions revealed nothing about their positions. Captain Brennan, General Hammond began, her voice measured and professional. This board has reviewed extensive documentation regarding your actions on the dates in question. We've heard testimony from Major Shaw, Captain Ortiz, the soldiers you rescued, your former commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hastings, and numerous others. Before we render our findings, we'd like to hear directly from you. In your own words, explain your decision-making process. Tasha had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times, but now that it was here, prepared speeches felt inadequate. She spoke from the heart instead. Ma'am, I've spent 8 years in the Air Force, and for most of that time, I believed that following the rules, exceeding standards, and demonstrating competence would eventually lead to opportunities. I was wrong. Not because the system is inherently broken, but because sometimes the system prioritizes order over outcomes, protocol over people. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When I learned that 540 soldiers were trapped in Tulmar Valley and that command had decided extraction was impossible, I faced a choice. I could accept that decision, trusting that people with more experience and higher rank had made the correct assessment. Or I could trust my own analysis, my own skills, and my own conscience. You chose the latter, Hammond observed, despite knowing the consequences. Yes, ma'am. Because I'd spent years preparing for exactly that kind of mission. I had the training, the skills, the understanding of what was required. The only thing I lacked was permission. And I realized that waiting for permission meant those soldiers would die. One of the other board members, a stern-looking colonel named Mitchell, leaned forward. Captain, you speak about trust in your own assessment. But military operations can't function if every officer decides individually which orders to follow. How do you reconcile your actions with the fundamental necessity of discipline and chain of command? It was the question Tasha had wrestled with for months. Sir, I don't have a perfect answer. I violated the chain of command, and that violation has consequences that I accept. But I'd ask the board to consider this. If the chain of command produces decisions that result in unnecessary death, doesn't someone have an obligation to challenge those decisions? That's a dangerous precedent, Mitchell countered. It suggests that individual judgment supersedes institutional authority. With respect, sir, institutional authority isn't infallible. The officers who declared the Tulmar Valley extraction impossible were wrong. The tactical assessments that wrote off 540 soldiers as acceptable losses were wrong. If I had followed orders, 361 people would be dead right now. Colonel Sanderson spoke up. Captain Brennan, during your time at Kandahar, did you ever formally raise concerns about gender-based discrimination or unfair treatment? No, ma'am. I documented instances privately, but I never filed official complaints. Why not? Tasha smiled bitterly. Because I knew what would happen. I'd be labeled as difficult, someone who couldn't handle the pressure, someone playing the gender card instead of focusing on performance. I'd seen it happen to other female officers. The complaints would be investigated, found to be unsubstantiated or exaggerated, and my career would be effectively over. So instead, you chose to prove your capabilities through unauthorized combat operations? No, ma'am. I chose to save lives when I had the capability to do so. The fact that it also demonstrated capabilities that had been dismissed for years was a secondary outcome. General Hammond reviewed documents on her tablet, then looked up. Captain Brennan, this board has reviewed Lieutenant Colonel Hastings's leadership record as part of our investigation. We found patterns of gender-based assignment decisions, systematic underutilization of qualified female personnel, and a command climate that discouraged challenging tactical assessments. These findings don't excuse your violations of military regulations, but they provide important context. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. We've also reviewed the flight data from your extractions. The technical analysis confirms that your approach vectors, terrain masking, and emergency procedures were textbook perfect, and in some cases, beyond what our standard training covers. Multiple senior aviators have testified that they're not certain they could have accomplished what you did. That said, Hammond continued, her tone hardening, you committed serious violations. You stole military aircraft. Twice. You disobeyed direct orders from your commanding officer. You operated outside established protocols in ways that could have resulted in loss of aircraft and personnel. Tasha felt her stomach tighten. This was it, the moment when her career ended officially. However, Hammond said, and Tasha's heart skipped, this board must also consider the outcomes of your actions. You saved 361 lives. You demonstrated aviation capabilities that exceeded our assessment of what was possible. You exposed systematic problems in our tactical evaluation processes and our utilization of qualified personnel. General Hammond stood, and the other board members followed suit. Captain Natasha Brennan, this board has reached the following determinations. First, regarding the charges of theft of military property and disobeying direct orders, we find that while your actions technically violated regulations, they were taken in extremis under circumstances where lawful orders would have resulted in substantial and unnecessary loss of life. Given the extraordinary circumstances and exceptional outcomes, this board recommends that formal charges be dismissed. Tasha felt tears threatening but maintained her composure. Second, Hammond continued, regarding your conduct and performance, this board finds that you demonstrated exceptional aviation skill, tactical acumen, and courage under fire. We are recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with Valor device, and immediate promotion to Major. The room seemed to spin slightly. Tasha had prepared herself for prison, for dishonorable discharge, for an end to everything she'd worked for. She hadn't prepared for this. Third, and most importantly, Hammond's voice took on a different quality. Your actions have forced this military to confront some uncomfortable truths about how we assess capability, how we respond to impossible situations, and how we sometimes allow institutional bias to override tactical necessity. As a result, Air Combat Command is implementing new protocols for tactical assessment, new review procedures for mission feasibility determinations, and mandatory training on utilizing the full capabilities of all qualified personnel, regardless of gender. Colonel Sanderson added, Major Brennan, you're also being assigned to a new position at Air Combat Command Headquarters. You'll be working directly with me to develop training programs that integrate the unconventional tactics, You employed during the Talmer Valley extractions. Your methods are being studied and will become part of how we train the next generation of combat aviators. Tasha found her voice, though it came out rougher than intended. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Say you'll continue serving with the same courage and skill you demonstrated in Talmer Valley, Hammond replied. Say you'll help us build a military that recognizes excellence regardless of who demonstrates it. Say you'll mentor young aviators, especially young women, who face the same barriers you faced. I will. Ma'am, absolutely. The hearing concluded. And as Tasha emerged from the Pentagon, she found Major Shaw waiting outside. He'd been promoted as well and reassigned to a training command position where his experience from Talmer Valley would be put to use. How'd it go? He asked, though her expression probably already told him. They're not court-martialing me. They're promoting me and giving me a position developing training programs. Shaw grinned. Outstanding. Though I have to say, watching you nearly give General Hammond a heart attack with that speech about challenging institutional authority was worth the trip to Washington. They walked through the Pentagon's corridors toward the exit, passing walls covered with photographs of military heroes from generations past. Tasha wondered if someday her story might inspire others the way those historical figures inspired her. Outside, a small group of reporters had gathered, having somehow learned about the hearing. Tasha had been advised to avoid media contact, but one voice called out that she couldn't ignore. Major Brennan, what do you want people to know about what happened in Talmer Valley? Tasha stopped and turned, considering the question carefully. Shaw gave her a look that said she didn't have to answer. But she knew this was important. I want people to know that the 361 soldiers who came home from Talmer Valley are heroes who survived impossible circumstances through courage and determination. I want people to know that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same, and having the courage to recognize that difference matters. And I want young people, especially young women, who dream of serving in roles where they're told they don't belong, to know that capability matters more than preconceptions. She paused, then added, I also want people to understand that I didn't do this alone. Major Shaw risked everything to help with this second extraction. Crew chiefs and maintenance personnel put their careers on the line to prepare my aircraft. Junior officers created opportunities for me to act. Change doesn't happen because one person takes a stand. It happens because enough people decide that the status quo isn't acceptable. 6 months later, Major Natasha Brennan stood in front of a classroom at the Air Force Weapons School, looking out at a diverse group of aviators who'd been selected for advanced combat training. The students included fighter pilots, transport specialists, helicopter crews, and combat support aviators, a deliberately integrated class that reflected the new approach to aviation training. My name is Major Brennan, she began, and I'm here to teach you about unconventional tactics in high-risk environments. Some of you may have heard about the Talmer Valley extractions. Some of you might have opinions about whether what I did was right or wrong. That's fine. We're not here to debate the ethics of my decisions. We're here to learn from what worked and what didn't. She activated the display screen, showing the terrain map of Talmer Valley. This was considered an impossible extraction. Multiple experienced commanders assessed the situation and concluded no viable option existed. They were wrong, but not because they were incompetent or cowardly. They were wrong because they evaluated the situation using conventional approaches and standard procedures. Tasha walked among the students as she spoke. The lesson isn't that you should disobey orders or ignore established procedures. The lesson is that when you encounter a situation where conventional wisdom says something is impossible, you have an obligation to ask, impossible for whom? Impossible with what tools? Impossible under what constraints? One student, a young female helicopter pilot, raised her hand. Major Brennan, how did you know you could pull off those extractions? How did you know you weren't just being reckless? It was a question Tasha had asked herself many times. I didn't know for certain, but I'd spent years preparing for exactly that kind of mission. I'd studied terrain masking techniques, practiced emergency procedures, understood the capabilities of my aircraft beyond what the manual specified. When the moment came, I had confidence based on preparation, not just hope. She returned to the front of the classroom. That's what I want you to take from this course. Prepare for the missions you might face, not just the missions you're assigned. Develop skills beyond your current role. Question assumptions, especially assumptions about what you're capable of accomplishing. And when you face a situation where following the rules leads to an unacceptable outcome, have the courage to explore alternatives. Over the following months, Tasha's influence extended far beyond that single classroom. Her story became a case study in military academies, a subject of doctoral dissertations on leadership and ethics, and an inspiration for service members facing their own battles against institutional bias. The Talmor Valley extractions led to tangible changes. Air Combat Command revised its mission feasibility assessment protocols. Personnel evaluation systems were reformed to reduce gender bias. Training programs were expanded to develop broader skill sets across aviation specialties. The military began actively recruiting stories of unconventional problem solving rather than viewing deviation from norms as inherently problematic. Lieutenant Colonel Hastings quietly retired from active duty 6 months after the review board's findings. His replacement at Kandahar implemented cultural changes that several female officers later credited with transforming the command climate. Captain Ortiz recovered from her injuries, requested assignment to work with Major Brennan on integrated combat tactics, bringing ground perspective to aviation training. The 361 soldiers rescued from Talmor Valley scattered across the military and civilian world. But many stayed in contact with Tasha. They sent photos of weddings they attended, children who were born, careers that continued, all the life moments that wouldn't have happened if she hadn't taken the risk she took. 2 years after the extractions, Major Natasha Brennan received notification that she'd been selected for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and assignment as commander of an aviation training squadron. The assignment came with a personal note from General Hammond. You challenged the system and made it better. Now it's your turn to shape the next generation of aviators who will continue that work. On her first day as squadron commander, Tasha stood in front of her new unit, a diverse group of pilots, crew members, and support personnel who would be her responsibility to train and lead. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the underestimated transport pilot to the commander, shaping how the military trained its aviation forces. I'm not going to tell you that following your conscience is easy, she told her new squadron. I'm not going to tell you that challenging the system won't have consequences. But I am going to tell you that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is recognize when the rules are wrong and have the courage to do what's right. Anyway, she looked at the faces watching her, young aviators at the start of their careers, seasoned veterans who'd seen combat, support personnel who kept everything running. Among them were women who'd cited her story as inspiration for joining the aviation field. People of diverse backgrounds who'd been told they didn't fit the traditional mold. You're here because you have skills this military needs. My job is to help you develop those skills to their fullest potential, and to ensure that when you face your own Talmor Valley moment, whatever form it takes, you have the preparation, the confidence, and the support to do what needs to be done. As the briefing ended and her squadron dispersed to their duties, Tasha remained in the briefing room for a moment, looking at the unit patch on her flight suit. It was different from the one she'd worn at Kandahar, but tucked in her desk. Drawer was another patch, the one signed by 361 soldiers who'd been left for dead until someone decided they were worth saving. That patch reminded her why she'd chosen this career, why she'd risked everything, why she continued to serve despite the challenges. Because military service, at its best, was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, about having skills and using them when they mattered most, about being the person who stood up when everyone else sat down. Lieutenant Colonel Natasha Brennan had been called too cautious, too steady, too weak for combat. She'd been underestimated, dismissed, and sidelined by people who couldn't see past their preconceptions. And then, when 540 soldiers needed someone who could do the impossible, she'd proven that steady didn't mean timid. It meant prepared. It meant competent. It meant ready for the moment when everyone else gave up. Her story would be told in military academies for generations, not just as a story about one dramatic rescue, but as a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept that impossible means impossible. 540 soldiers had been left for dead. One pilot ignored protocol and saved them all. And in doing so, she changed what it meant to be a leader, what it meant to show courage, and what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when the entire system stood against you. Some people follow the rules. Some people break the rules. The truly exceptional ones understand when the rules themselves need to be rewritten. Natasha Brennan had done all three. And the military, and the 361 people who came home because of her, would never be the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.